Of all the countries we've ever looked at on this channel, there's a fair argument that the defence economics of North Korea are by far the strangest. This is a country that, over the last several decades, has had to repeatedly call on international donors to help feed its people, but which has apparently managed to find the resources to maintain an active duty military so large that it's consistently been in the top 5 largest globally. It's a country that struggles to provide many of its people with access to things like electricity, but which has apparently managed to build up a small arsenal of nuclear weapons as well as the missile systems to potentially deliver them. It's one of the world's most insular and highly militarised nations, with tightly controlled borders and a population that's largely denied access to foreign media and information. But just because North Korea is that closed off from the world doesn't mean it can't have a significant impact on global events, whether by threatening other states with nuclear annihilation whenever it doesn't get what it wants, or by potentially opening up its vast stockpiles of older weapons and ammunition to the Russian Federation. And given just how unique and potentially influential this nation is from a defence economics perspective, today I thought it was time to talk about it. To do that, as always, we'll start with a little North Korean military and economic history, looking both at how the Korean People's Army evolved into what it is today, and why, paradoxically, increasing military spending may actually have resulted in a weaker North Korean military. Then we'll work our way through North Korea's strategic context, potential objectives, its way or philosophy of war, and then each of the elements that makes up the Korean People's Army: ground forces, air forces, navy, and paramilitary. We'll then close out by looking at 2 elements that make Pyongyang a potentially destabilising actor on the world stage: its nuclear program and increased cooperation with Moscow. The caveat up front is that while there's always uncertainty when talking about these sort of topics, today we're talking about a country that dials the secrecy and propaganda so high that they make the Russian MOD look like a reliable source of information. As a result, while I have used some North Korean sources, I'm heavily dependent on foreign analysis. In particular, you'll see a range of quotes from ATP 7-100.2, which is the US military's roughly 300-page piece on North Korean tactics and doctrine, as well as a range of other assessments, including those by the US Defense Intelligence Agency, that I will link in the description. For the sake of balance and potential comedic relief, I did spend the months leading up to this episode reviewing a number of North Korean publications, including the multi-volume English-language biography of former North Korean leader Kim Jong-il, a very unique bit of writing that I will occasionally reference as we move through the topic. Caveats in place, let's get into it. Now, as we often do, I want to start here with a bit of history. Given I've already done a video on South Korean military strategy where I covered some of Korea's long military history and traditions, I'm comfortable skipping over most of that today, but please do consider watching that video if you missed it. Instead, I want to start with the Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula in the early 20th century, and in particular how resistance to and the aftermath of that occupation helped shape North Korea as we know it today. By simple virtue of geography, what we now know as North Korea had significant potential value to the Japanese war effort. While the south has a majority of the Korean Peninsula's arable land, the north has by far the lion's share of its mineral resources. Those resources, as well as things like Korea's agricultural output and industrial potential, were obviously of significant interest to Imperial Japan. As with many other places in Asia, the Korean Peninsula would suffer many cases of Imperial Japan doing Imperial Japan things during the years it controlled the peninsula. But as Japan collapsed, 2 very different forces would move into Korea. The south we've talked about before, but the north would quickly come under the rule of Kim Il-sung and his dynasty. Why that happened depends very much on what version of history you prefer. In the biography of his son, Kim Il-sung was the undisputed, indispensable leader of Korean resistance against Japanese occupation. He would welcome his son into the world in 1942 at a secret military camp in occupied Korea, near a mountain with immense cultural, historical, and spiritual significance. That's very interesting because Soviet records seem to suggest he was actually born in the Soviet Union, while Kim Il-sung would serve in an international unit of the Red Army for the duration of the Second World War. In one version of history, Kim Il-sung would become the leader of North Korea because he clearly possessed all of the characteristics that made him perfect for the role. He was a genius, leader, military mastermind, and many more things beside. In other versions of history, things were a bit different, but he still had something that set him apart. Specifically, he had the backing of the Soviet Union and the patronage of Joseph Stalin. That gave the early DPRK significant access to economic and military assistance. The Soviets did, after all, end World War II with approximately infinite T-34 and artillery pieces left over, and Kim Il-sung apparently had a couple of ideas of how they might be put to use. Reportedly, after initially opposing any attempt to reunify the Korean Peninsula by force, Stalin would change his mind in 1950. and the Korean War as we know it would begin in earnest in the June of that year. In the initial stages, the Korean People's Army enjoyed massive advantages over their largely South Korean opponents. While it might seem strange to us now, by 1950 standards, a lot of the North Korean equipment was relatively good. Advantages across a range of fields aggregated and produced some very rapid North Korean advances. By late June, the KPA had overtaken Seoul. By late July, much of South Korea's territory had fallen, and less than 3 months into the North Korean operation, the remaining South Korean and Allied forces had been pushed back into a pocket in the southeast of the country. This was the famous Pusan perimeter, and it represented the high watermark of the KPA's advance. The North Koreans had arguably moved quickly and decisively, but not quickly and decisively enough. This was 1950, and the UN looked very different to the way it does today. The People's Republic of China didn't control the Chinese veto, and the Soviets who did have a veto were in the middle of boycotting the UNSC. That relatively unique set of circumstances paved the way for the United Nations to approve a military intervention. A lot of nations that would join that UN intervention had been pretty quick to demobilise at the end of the Second World War. But even with those challenges, the resource disparity grew enormously quickly, especially at sea and in the air. Even North Korean materials tend to acknowledge that mismatch, with Kim Jong-il's biography, for example, talking about an incident where the 8-year-old was watching an aerial combat with his father between 2 North Korean and 20 US aircraft, with the child confidently declaring that the Korean planes would win if they fought courageously because, quote, the Yankee planes were marauders. In the story, that's obviously what ended up happening, but overall North Korean forces would suffer grievously at the hands of UN aviation. The DPRK's forces would be pushed back, first out of ROK territory, and then deep into North Korea itself. The DPRK would be saved from complete collapse by the intervention of Chinese forces. And after extensive and very costly fighting, an armistice would eventually be agreed. As a ceasefire rather than a peace treaty, the armistice didn't represent a final negotiated end to the war. And to this day, legally, the Korean War isn't so much over as it is on pause. But in the 70 years since, despite a number of skirmishes, provocations and casualties, a return to full-scale fighting has thus far been avoided. But while the guns largely fell silent in 1953, North Korea's economic and military development continued apace. And before we get to the North Korean forces themselves, we're going to stop and talk about that for a moment. Because of all the states we've looked at on this channel, North Korea may have some of the most unique defence economics lessons to teach. Not in a good sense, mind you, more as a kind of illustrated guide on what not to do if you don't want to blow up your economic and military potential long term. The starting point here, which I teased earlier, is before the outbreak of the Korean War, North Korea was the wealthier and more powerful of the 2 Korean states. And while, yes, strategic bombing during the Korean War did pretty comprehensively hit delete on a lot of the country's infrastructure, in the 1950s and early 60s, the economy and industrial output grew relatively quickly. There were problems mounting behind the scenes, however, and had a lot to do with what was driving that growth. If you want to develop an economy, you can do it the slow way. Or you can take all sorts of shortcuts that make you look great in the short term and never ever go wrong later. At the top of that list is convincing other countries to give you stuff, free or otherwise. North Korea became a massive recipient of foreign aid, and also a prolific borrower. It racked up debts both inside and outside the Soviet bloc, endured a reduction in Soviet aid when the country pivoted more towards the People's Republic of China, and GDP growth later in the 60s and early 70s would first slow and then begin to stagnate. By the end of the 70s, the North Korean economy, once larger than the South Korean equivalent, was now a fraction of its size, and the country had gone through the process of either renegotiating or defaulting on much of its international debt. To cite just one example, as of a couple of years ago, I believe Sweden was still chasing payment from North Korea for 1,000 Volvos delivered back in 1974. Whether you're talking about nations, businesses, or individuals, often it's relatively easy to make line go up as long as you're willing to set fire to obscene amounts of money. The problems tend to start in earnest when people will no longer give or lend you any more. However, even though North Korea's economic growth was slowing in the later stages of the Cold War, in many respects its military ambitions weren't. In December 1962, Kim Il-sung espoused the so-called 4 military guidelines. Those guidelines set out some very humble and affordable goals, including arming the entire population, fortifying the entire country, training the entire army as a cadre force, and modernising weapons, doctrines, and tactics under the principle of self-reliance in national defence. Meaning it wouldn't be enough, hypothetically, to simply secure additional military supplies from Moscow or Beijing. No, the country, which had been comprehensively flattened about a decade earlier, would have to be able to build as much as possible of it itself. This theme of self-reliance comes up again and again in North Korean materials. And indeed, there appears to be a recurring type of scene in Kim Jong-il's biography where basically someone around him says something that seems reasonable. Kim Jong-il basically says that doesn't align with something my father said, and then the relevant observers and/or author remark on how correct he obviously is. The example I'd give here is that as a teenager in the 50s, Kim Jong-il was apparently going to school and listening to a speech by the principal for suggesting that maybe North Korea would be better off importing things like tractors and lorries from countries that already had production lines for them, think Soviet Union, and implicitly instead focusing on areas of comparative advantage. Kim Jong-il reportedly stood up and, quote, put forth the party's basic line on economic construction based on developing heavy industry on a preferential basis, and then asked the lecturer to clarify his point. The lecturer apparently excused himself while Kim Jong-il turned to the other students present and said that the lecture had been seriously diversionary in its content, and that when anyone said anything, quote, we must compare it with the Marshall's revolutionary idea, and if we find any difference, we must reject it immediately. The book notes that the lecturer was later discovered to be a, quote, factionalist, and so I presume things didn't end particularly well for him. I bring this up to suggest that in the North Korean economic model, often when efficiency and self-reliance came head-to-head, self-reliance, this Juche ideology, was the only one walking away from the fight. The powers that be also stressed that military modernisation would have to continue, even as the economy began to struggle. To quote from a USDIA assessment, in the 1970s and 80s, the North Korean regime accelerated and redirected KPA modernisation initiatives towards re-establishing offensive conventional warfare capabilities. Over time, the KPA underwent significant enlargement. In 1960, the ground forces might have numbered around 400,000 active personnel. About 30 years later, that number had more than doubled to around 950,000. Arguably an even greater economic challenge for North Korea came in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This robbed the DPRK not just of a long-term ally, but also a very generous supporter. The Russian Federation of the early 1990s had neither the motive nor the means to be as generous as the Soviet Union once had. And partly as a result of that, North Korea's economy would contract dramatically over the course of that decade. And as economic calamity, mismanagement, and natural disasters all came together, the country would also go through periods of protracted mass hunger. The North Korean government obviously responded to the food shortages in the only reasonable way possible. It reportedly heavily restricted the use of words like famine or hunger, and instead referred to the experience as the arduous march. Often when we talk about defence spending, we use the guns and butter trade-off as a metaphor. Different countries come up with different answers to how you balance the needs of the civilian economy and population against your national defence requirements. And in many nations, especially relatively wealthy ones, the trade-off usually isn't literally between firepower and foodstuffs. It's between defence spending and a wide range of alternative government priorities. But in the 1990s, the North Korean government confronted a situation where food shortages were literally an issue on a massive scale, and in a sense, responded by just slamming the guns button even harder. Kim Jong-il would introduce the military first, or Songun policy. That even further elevated the position of the KPA in North Korean society, and guaranteed that the military would continue to be able to take a major share of the country's meagre economic resources. In defence economics terms, in the late 20th and early 21st century, North Korea arguably maintained its military power through the crudest of means. It just jacked up personnel counts and spending as a percentage of GDP. Estimates are obviously very hard to come up with given the nature of the North Korean economy, but most estimates I've found suggest that during the 1980s, North Korea was spending about 20% of its GDP on the military. In the 2020s, US estimates put that number somewhere between 20 and 30%. To put that into perspective, it would mean that North Korea now is spending between 2 and 3 times as much as a share of its limited GDP than the US was while actively fighting the Korean War and engaging in an arms build-up against the Soviet Union in the early 1950s. And even that comparison probably vastly undersells the priority the North Korean government have given to the military and the opportunity costs involved. All else being equal, you would expect wealthier nations to be better able to sustain high percentage of GDP war expenditures over sustained periods. They can likely borrow more, have more assets, and more potential fat in the economy. If you conscript every second used car salesman in the United States, the economy might feel it, but no one's likely to starve. But if a lot of your population is engaged in simple agriculture, barely managing to feed everyone, calling up a significant chunk of them might have some much more serious results. However you cut it, the DPRK is pretty far down one end of the economic spectrum, and it's not the wealthy end. And yet, it's sustained the sort of defence spending percentages you'd normally only expect to see during a major conflict, year after year after year, decade after decade after decade. And here we come to what you might call the paradox of Songun, where consistently putting the military first results in a worse force. North Korea began with an economic advantage over its southern rival, and it then continued to dedicate more of its resources to the military than Seoul did. But decades on, the result is Seoul having a much larger military budget, a more modern force, and North Korea falling ever further behind in military terms because while it was building an army, South Korea was building an economy. South Korea's population now is about twice that of the North, and their industrial and technological capabilities are pretty much worlds apart at this point. There are obviously a huge range of social, economic and political factors that go into explaining that divergence. But part of it is probably that North Korea has pulled the real-world equivalent of sending half your workers off with your military units at the start of a game of StarCraft 2 or Age of Empires. The broader defence economics observation here is that for most countries, there's probably a defence spending sweet spot, and over the long term, capability may not scale as that percentage climbs. If you show me two otherwise identical countries, and one is spending 2% and the other 4% on defence, and you tell me nothing else about them, then 25 years down the track, my money's on 4% to have the better defence industrial base and armed forces. But if you show me one country at 4% and another at 34%, my money is still going to be on 4%, because 25 years down the track, Team 34% might be figuring out that you can't eat bayonets. With all that said, let's look at the Korean People's Army of 2024. So, as with any other country, let's talk strategic objectives. What sort of objectives might North Korea be relying on its military to achieve, and how might that shape their force design? Again, unfortunately for us, North Korea isn't big on publishing strategy documents or white papers, but some Western analysis has put forward 3 primary objectives as well as a number of secondary ones. The first is very simple and not uncommon for authoritarian states, and that's regime security. And in the case of the DPRK, we can probably narrow that security even more to focus on just a few key individuals. As the US document puts it, quote, "The first goal is for Kim Jong-un and his family to maintain their position of authority in the regime through the ideological control of the country's population. The Kim family and its supporters will likely pursue any strategy necessary to remain firmly in power." End quote. In other words, whereas in some countries the military exists to protect the nation, in others the ruling party, in North Korea the first goal is the protection of a single individual and preferred members of their family. As Kim Jong-il's biography reflecting on his father's ideas put it, quote, "In order to defend the revolutionary cause of the working class, the revolutionary armed force should serve as an army of the leader." End quote. There are a lot of people out there that have bodyguards, but not too many that have millions of them. The point around ideological control here is also arguably an important one. In the DPRK, a family's status and ideological reliability, if you will, is partially reflected by something called the Songun system. This divides the population essentially into various segments based on factors like ancestry and background. If your family was involved in resistance against the Japanese, or were factory workers at the time of the communist takeover, or have been major participants in the Communist Party, then you might be part of the roughly 30% of North Koreans fitting into the core or preferred class. A plurality, roughly 40% of North Koreans, are believed to fit into a middling, wavering, or ordinary class. Then at the bottom, you have roughly 30% of the population that are considered potentially hostile or undesirable. It's important to stress that while foreign analysts, academics, and North Korean defectors have all talked about the implications of this system and what it might mean for an individual's access to things like housing or employment opportunities, and indeed during the famine of the 1990s, some foreign commentators assessed that it was often Songbun that determined whether someone ate or starved. The official North Korean position, however, is that Songbun isn't really a thing, and everyone is equal, except presumably the semi-divine leader and his family, of course. The defence of the nation and its independence then gets bumped to goal number 2. Quote, "The second goal is for North Korea to remain an independent state, free from outside interference, especially from Western powers. The possession of a nuclear arsenal and its pursuit of missile technology are attempts to ensure powers do not interfere with its internal affairs for fear of nuclear reprisal." End quote. There's 2 bits to unpack there, one related to force design and the other to the objective itself. From a force design perspective, you can probably understand why Objective 1 and 2 would call for very different militaries. Nuclear weapons might be a powerful tool if you're looking to threaten or deter neighbouring states. but they might not be the ideal system if you're trying to, I don't know, suppress a riot or put down a coup. That instead demands a very large armed paramilitary and internal security force staffed with individuals that you would hope are loyal to the regime. And as we'll see a little bit later on, the way North Korea tries to square the circle between those two different requirements, despite its very limited resources, is to just have both anyway. Even if that potentially means resorting to a range of creative funding mechanisms, including, allegedly, counterfeiting foreign banknotes and hacking cryptocurrency. The other point here is this apparent goal of protecting national independence doesn't seem to just extend to Western powers. The DPRK has often also been very suspicious of its allies. To quote one US document discussing North Korea's relationship with traditional allies, Beijing and Moscow, quote, Pyongyang tends to show relatively little trust in either country. The North fears absorption or preemption by a much more powerful China, and probably wants to preserve its political independence from Beijing, even at the cost of alienating the Chinese leadership, end quote. North Korea's nuclear arsenal is perhaps one of the clearest public indicators of that desire. Arguably, neither Russia or China benefit from a nuclear-armed North Korea. It increases instability in the region and significantly reduces Pyongyang's reliance on Beijing for security guarantees and protection. And there is perhaps a reason that both Russia and China, which had vetoes on the Security Council, didn't choose to exercise them to stop a series of sanctions being placed against the North Korean nuclear and missile programs. But despite all the pressure against it, North Korea ultimately decided to do it anyway. Then, goal 3, and probably the one the North Koreans themselves talk about loudly and publicly the most often, is the prospect of reunification. From Kim Il-sung all the way through to the current regime of Kim Jong-un, the idea of reunifying the Korean Peninsula under the North Korean government and the leadership of the Kim family has always been something of a central reason for being at the heart of the North Korean state. You'll arguably see the continued importance of this goal reflected in things like force structure and force posture when we talk about the Korean People's Army a little later on. But it's worth noting right up front that of the 3 primary objectives, this one is by far the biggest reach. ROK citizens aren't exactly lining up to voluntarily place themselves under Kim Jong-un's rule. And as one US document puts it, quote, this ambition is probably not obtainable as long as US/UN forces remain on the peninsula, end quote. The result is that since the end of the Korean War in the 1950s, the North Korean leadership has continually kicked the can down the road on the topic of armed reunification, year after year, decade after decade, all the while, in a sense, having to invest in a third set of military capabilities, as the KPA has had to work to maintaining a massive internal security force, an external-facing nuclear deterrence force, and everything you would expect to go into a large conventional military capable of potentially re-invading the South, directly into the teeth of one of Asia's largest and best-funded militaries and its American allies. While we thankfully haven't seen the DPRK yet attempt Korean War II Electric Boogaloo, we have continually seen it use force or the threat of force in order to intimidate and obtain concessions from its neighbours. Quote, the country uses limited military provocations to obtain diplomatic concessions at the negotiating table with South Korea, Japan and the United States and other countries. It also uses the threat of possible war to obtain humanitarian aid. We've seen this play out many times in many different ways, but the basic structure would be something like this. North Korea starts by doing something that might be perceived as aggressive or that it's very much not meant to do, like testing missile systems or enriching uranium. Everyone says, hey, you're not meant to do that, and North Korea responds with some sort of apocalyptic threat. In recent years, that threat might be nuclear in nature, with Kim Jong-un earlier this year reportedly threatening to, quote, deliver a devastating blow, completely annihilating the enemy's capitals and the pack of military gangsters, deploying the full arsenal of super-powerful means, end quote. Now, under present conditions, I'm not sure exactly how deterred many Americans would be by the threatened nuclear destruction of Washington, D.C., but they would probably be fairly sad to see anything happen to Seoul or Tokyo. So, once North Korea succeeds in raising the temperature, oftentimes historically it's then been time for negotiations. North Korea might agree to pause or scale back on those missile tests or nuclear enrichment, for example, in exchange for some sort of additional assistance or relief. An interesting extension here is that perceived threats don't necessarily have to be military or even geopolitical. In a country where everything from housing to haircuts is tightly regulated by the government, even cultural influences can be considered a potential threat. That includes what might be called corrosive outside information, including foreign media that depicts, for example, daily life in South Korea, which might provide certain clues to North Korean viewers, like the apparent presence of things like freedom, electricity, and considerably less starvation in the south, that maybe, just maybe, North Korea is not in fact the best Korea. Kim Jong-il's biography talks about the importance of, quote, checking the aggressive cultural infiltration of imperialists. And as recently as this year, a report came out indicating that a 22-year-old may have been executed in North Korea for watching and sharing South Korean films and music. As the US DIA puts it, quote, since the 2000s, North Korea has attempted various military and security efforts to monitor and deal with unsanctioned activity, but has been forced to accept a degree of risk posed by the influx of outside media, end quote. But being willing to accept a degree of risk doesn't mean the North Korean military hasn't responded on a number of occasions when foreign actors have tried to introduce that sort of material into North Korea. Earlier this year, for example, it was reported that some South Korean activists were floating things like USBs packed with K-drama across the border using balloons. North Korea then apparently responded by floating upwards of 900 balloons back into the Republic of Korea, carrying such things as cigarette butts, manure, soiled nappies, and rubbish of various kinds. The extent to which this represented a case of one or both nations sending their best, so to speak, I'll leave to the audience. North Korea's Vice Defense Minister then made a statement about this bombardment of South Korea using balloons full of shit, reportedly saying, quote, we made the ROK clans get enough experience of how unpleasant they feel and how much effort is needed to remove the scattered waste paper, end quote. Because as we all know, the way you achieve meaningful deterrence against an opponent is with weaponized littering. Seoul, of course, responded with the obvious next step on the escalation ladder and resumed the practice of blasting K-pop across the border using massive speakers, a practice which had previously been suspended a number of years ago. For its part, the DPRK is also a master of several other super effective deterrence and signalling mechanisms, including the launch of a seemingly ever-increasing number of very expensive missiles into the Sea of Japan, because nothing scares your opponents quite like reducing the size of your active missile inventory. Tests are obviously important, but there's a significant difference between the 8 tests North Korea staged in 2009 and the nearly 70 that it launched in 2022. I think it's important to remember, though, that amidst all the weaponized K-pop and state-sponsored nappy bombs, there's also a lethal edge that often comes up to this posturing and skirmishing. At various times, North Korea has sent special operations forces across the border, shelled South Korean territory, torpedoed a South Korean ship, planted landmines on the ROK side of the border, and of course, reportedly assassinated Kim Jong-il's eldest son, Kim Jong-nam, in Malaysia back in 2017 using VX nerve agent. Yes, a lot of things to do with North Korea can verge on the ridiculous, but on occasion the consequences can be very much lethal. Okay, so with that understanding of North Korea's strategic environment and potential objectives in place, let's now talk about the North Korean military. And as we often do, I want to start by looking at the Korean People's Army as a whole before zooming in on each of the individual components, the ground forces, the air force, the navy, and the paramilitaries. Because while yes, all the services are always going to be separate to a degree, they should be tied together by a common philosophy, a North Korean way of war. North Korea's military philosophy, ideology, doctrine is in some ways an interesting mix. It's been described as developing from a mix of North Korean experiences between 1950 and 1953, Soviet and Russian military theory, Chinese light infantry tactics, and some tweaks and additions based on observations around American experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other locations around the world. And if you think that sounds like an eclectic mix, well, arguably that's because it is. And one shaped by the fact that for more than 70 years at this point, the development of North Korean military theory has been purely theoretical. The KPA hasn't really fought a major engagement since the ceasefire put the Korean War on hold in 1953. Which does to me raise a question of where blokes like these won all their medals and just how many of them were earned in the Great Ship Balloon Offensive of 2024, but I do digress. When you start digging into what we think we know about North Korean military thinking, there's a few elements that start to stand out. For example, this is a force that represents its likely asymmetric position compared to its potential adversaries and reflects that in some of its thinking. The KPA seems to understand, for example, that flying against the South Korean and US Air Forces is unlikely to make for the most permissive of environments, and so it likely plans to use large amounts of artillery and MRLs in lieu of air support. There also appears to be some understanding of the technological gap in play between the KPA and its likely adversaries, meaning mass is often sought as a substitute. As one US document puts it, the KPA will attempt to concentrate and coordinate the firing of large numbers of older weapon systems in order to make up for a shortage of the latest technologically advanced equipment. In that respect, we might anticipate that they'll be looking at the experiences of Russian artillery crews in Ukraine operating older Soviet artillery systems against modern NATO ones particularly closely. But one of the more unique elements that comes out of North Korean military thinking is this commitment to what is sometimes called two-front warfare. And while the term might sound intuitive, the meaning isn't. For the KPA, a potential war against the South and its allies can be thought of being split into two separate fronts. The first is what we might think of as the conventional military effort, at the front and otherwise. An assault across the demilitarized zone, mass fires, missile attacks, including the use of some very nasty restricted weapon systems against bases, C2 nodes, etc. in the enemy rear, to potentially accomplish a conventional goal, like isolating and potentially taking Seoul, and as a part of that conventional military effort, also potentially missile attacks against American targets. All of that together would represent the first front. The second front would be a very large-scale behind-the-lines effort. We're talking special forces operations, behind-the-lines raids, infiltration and sabotage efforts on a truly grandiose scale. To that end, the Korean People's Army Special Purpose Forces Command has an estimated personnel strength of 88,000. To put that into perspective, it means that the DPRK, with an approximate population of around 26 million, has more active duty personnel in its Special Purpose Forces Command alone than the nation of Canada, approximate population closer to 40 million, has in its entire armed forces. It also means that North Korea's Special Purpose Forces Command may well be significantly larger than America's Special Operations Command, or SOCOM. And that's just according to the definitions that are used in military balance. According to those used by the US DIA, the actual figure is above 200,000, apparently due to multiple North Korean light infantry formations being absorbed into the force. Presumably because if you just call people special forces, they obviously get better at their jobs. If the war ever went hot, it's expected that North Korean Special Forces units would surge south en masse. One imagines that the casualty projections for those sort of operations would be fairly close to total. Infiltration would be difficult, exfiltration presumably hellish. But the idea seems to be that the amount of damage, confusion and shock caused may well be worth it. Another element of KPA military thinking I want to tease out probably dates all the way back to their experiences of the 1950s. During the Korean War, the KPA started the war with a mass and firepower advantage. But once UN forces got their act together, that firepower dynamic shifted incredibly decisively. North Korean and later Chinese units would take absolutely horrendous casualties from United Nations artillery. And under US General Van Fleet, for a period the shell allocation per 155mm gun reached about 250 per day. We often think of Russia as using a lot of artillery ammunition in Ukraine, but at those rates, UN artillery in Korea would burn through Russia's annual supply of artillery ammunition in a matter of weeks. Being obliterated by indirect fires is usually not a part of any force's preferred battle plan, and so North Korean military thinkers have had to sort of build in a potential solution to this historical problem. On the defence, you can try and dig deep or conceal your positions, but if your goal is to attack, things get a little bit more complicated. One of the ones they're believed to have come up with would be familiar to anyone who studied North Vietnamese military tactics during the Vietnam War. You get your force so incredibly close to your opponent that you can grab them by the proverbial belt buckle and deny them the use of their own fire support. If your troops are 50, 25, 10 metres from opposing positions, they may not be willing to saturate the area in high explosive. One question I'd raise as an observer, though, is based on what we've seen in Ukraine, just how viable that is as a countermeasure in 2024. Weapon systems are more accurate than ever before, ISR is more available than ever before, networking is better than ever before, battle management systems are more advanced than ever before, and while yes, Russian electronic warfare has sometimes denied Ukrainian forces ready access to precision, North Korea is very much not Russia, arguably the best EW power in the world. And in terms of networking, communication and precision capabilities, Ukraine is not the United States. So while I genuinely hope we never find out whether this North Korean approach would work at scale under battlefield conditions, I do think there are reasons to have some doubts. So in terms of how the DPRK might then try to fight a conventional war, it might be worth splitting it up into two phases. At first, the analysis often goes there would be an extremely high-intensity effort to try achieve victory quickly. Foreign analysts suggest there's a couple of elements that might go into this line of North Korean thinking. Firstly, some very optimistic political assumptions. These include the assumption that decision-making in the US and various other allied states would be very slow, and as a result, if victory could be achieved quickly enough, then Washington and the ROK's other allies may just accept a fait accompli. Completely the opposite of what they actually did the last time the North invaded the South, building up a bunch of military resources and then inflicting a crushing military defeat on the KPA. While the US DIA assesses that the KPA does understand that it would likely be outmatched and unable to defeat the full force of the United States and South Korea, other documents suggest that some in the KPA may also believe that it may only need a 2-to-1 advantage at the decisive point in order to achieve offensive success. And indeed, for many leaders in North Korea, some degree of offensive success seems to be basically assumed. To quote from ATP 7-100.2, while totally unrealistic, some North Korean leaders actually believe that, in the right military and political conditions, their goal of reaching Busan could occur in less than a month. However, some South Korean reports indicate that several KPA generals now believe that the capture of the entire peninsula is an impossibility, and that after the capture of Seoul, North Korea would need to sue for a negotiated peace based on its position of greater strength. End quote. So basically, even some of the more reasonably minded only think they'll be able to take the South Korean capital quickly, as opposed to overrunning the entire country. I'm not sure what exactly the political and military conditions the KPA envisages being able to accomplish such a feat under, but I can only presume it includes the entire ROK and US military suffering spontaneous existence failure immediately before the operation. In terms of why those sort of assumptions might be made, there's probably at least two elements going into it. The first is, that's what they were able to accomplish last time, in the 1950s. Although I'd argue there is a slight difference between South Korea's military capability in 2024 and 1950. The second element is that the KPA probably needs to plan for a rapid victory because it doesn't really have the capacity to plan for a slow one. In a sense, while you might think of the North Korean and Russian militaries as sharing at least some common DNA when it comes to things like doctrine and equipment, I'd argue their recently evolved forms are very, very different. The Russian military, as we've seen in Ukraine, has developed into a sort of marathon runner, and over the nearly 2.5 years that have followed, Russia has consistently been able to generate or regenerate new units and combat power. Russia has vast storages of equipment, is an energy and agricultural exporter, and has been able to carry on with its war economy even under international sanctions. The KPA, by contrast, is a sprinter through and through. The vast majority of its combat power is postured forward, close to the border. But the biggest driver and limiter is probably just logistics. The DMZ in Korea is so densely fortified and saturated with fires that any offensive operation there by either side is likely to be very, very difficult without significant preparation by fire. But reading some North Korean publications and foreign analysis, the KPA may still be ideologically disposed to attempt offensive operations anyway. There's a scene in Kim Jong-il's biography where a military leader who's been told that he needs to prepare his units to be able to defeat the enemy, even if he's outmatched 100-1, responds that might be possible if they prepare appropriate defensive positions. Kim Jong-il basically rebuffs him and says that the slogan requires, quote, in essence that each soldier be prepared to face 100 enemies, not only in defence, but also in attack. Each soldier of the People's Army should become a match for 100 in the attack, as well as in defensive battle. To quote ATP 7-100.2 again, the KPA prefers the offense to the defense and will remain on the former unless forced to temporarily go on the latter. One reason that might potentially explain that is that the country just simply doesn't have the resources to sustain a protracted defensive war. A DIA assessment in 2021 suggests that North Korea may only have sufficient supplies for 2 to 3 months of defensive fighting, with subsistence supplies like food and fuel being good for about 3 months and ammunition slightly longer. Even if the resources were available, the country's transportation infrastructure to move those resources is generally assessed as being in pretty poor shape. A lot of the terrain is very difficult, some of the roads and railways damaged, and many roads are believed to still be unpaved gravel or dirt surfaces. Now, yes, in the event of a full-scale war, it is possible that the rate at which the North Korean military consumes things like fuel and ammunition will be rapidly reduced, as the US and ROK move to rapidly reduce the number of consumers. But given that things like supply depots and transportation infrastructure might also be pretty high up the target priority list, I don't see any reason to immediately throw out that 2 to 3 month assessment, especially since it's more generous than some of the other ones I've seen. In essence then, the KPA might throw an enormous amount of manpower and equipment at any problem in the opening stages of a war, But if the opponent isn't defeated or surrendered at the end of that short sprint, it's going to start to run out of options very quickly. In the 21st century, high-intensity operations just don't tend to work very well without fuel or ammunition. From there, we'd potentially see the KPA try to lower the intensity and tempo of any conflict, likely trying to bog it down and maintain a defence using the resources it would still have available to it. Think fortifications, minefields, and lots of manpower. A lot of the KPA's reserve and paramilitary units don't really have that much in the way of heavy equipment, and so one potential mode of employment for them, as morbid as it sounds, might be to trade bodies for time until the other side potentially agrees to some sort of negotiated settlement, which does bring us to the question of numbers and just how many bodies we might be talking about here. On paper, despite having a population of only around 26 million, the Korean People's Army ground forces are believed to be some of the largest in the world, with an estimated personnel count of 1.1 million active. To put that in perspective, that puts the KPA ground forces in roughly the same size category as the Indian Army, despite India having a population very roughly 55 times larger. North Korea is unsurprisingly a conscription state, and conscript liability for the ground forces is between 5 and 12 years. That's then followed with compulsory part-time service until age 40, and then liability for the Red Guards up to age 60. Just the regular organised component of that reserve force for the army is believed to total about 600,000, and the various lightly armed paramilitary units number well into the millions. As well as a lot of manpower, the KPA ground forces are believed to have a lot of heavy equipment, at least by international standards. We're talking 3,500 main battle tanks, more than 500 light tanks, 2,500 APCs, 8,600 tube artillery pieces, towed and self-propelled, and 5,500 multiple rocket launchers, with all of those being the very rough military balance estimates. The human brain tends to struggle when we start dealing with hard numbers, so let's express it a different way. If all of those numbers hold true in some equipment categories, the North Koreans might have more active equipment on paper than the Russian military. However, at bare minimum, I'd suggest those estimates come with a hat trick of asterisks, with the first being that a lot of that stuff is really, really old. The APC component is believed to mostly be older BTR models or derivatives. The main battle tank component does include some more recent models, but ranges all the way back to, I kid you not, T-34s. And while to be sure, there are a lot of guns in that artillery park, a lot of the time what would be considered top shelf in the KPA might be considered pretty close to bottom of the barrel for forces like the Russians or the PLA. Yes, the KPA is believed to operate small numbers of some very niche, very dangerous systems. For example, North Korea does have a 600mm multiple launch rocket system, capable of firing some very heavy ordnance deep into the operational depths and kind of blurring the lines between a multiple rocket launcher and a TBM. But for the most part, we're talking vast fields of relics and museum pieces. Last week, we talked about some of the older pieces that Russia has been forced to reactivate for service in Ukraine. Think the D-30s designed in the 1950s or the M46 designed in the 1940s. And at the time, we were basically using those systems as a kind of proxy for the way the Russian artillery force was evolving backwards over time. But for the DPRK, things like D-30 and M46 are much, much closer to the top of the shelf. One US report even described the 70-plus-year-old M46s as the most capable counter-battery piece in the North Korean inventory. Presumably because, despite its immense age and weight, it can still fling that 130mm shell a considerable distance. The key point here is that while the KPA has expanded its manpower count since the 1980s, it's never had the funds or resources available for a comprehensive equipment refresh. It does have the resources and industrial capacity necessary to come up with new designs for various systems, but it has nowhere near the defence industrial base to actually equip the force with them at scale. And so the further away you get from the public-facing parades and cameras, the older the equipment is likely to get. Age and industrial constraints ties into point 2, which is a factor not just for the Korean People's Army ground forces, but also for the Air Force and Navy when we go on to look at them. And that's the question of readiness. How much of this old shit actually works? This is incredibly difficult from the outside looking in, but if I had to put money down, I'd suggest there might be some issues here. We often describe old Soviet equipment as very rugged and easy to repair, which in many cases is a fairly accurate description. But if you talk to, for example, Ukrainian troops that actually have to operate some of the older Soviet garbage out there, their feedback will often be along the lines of, yes, it's a relatively simple vehicle, but it's also 60 years old and breaks down all the bloody time. So when we're talking about equipment that hasn't been carefully maintained and selected for participation in things like public demonstration and parade duties, you have to start asking questions like how many hours are on that engine? How many rounds have gone through that barrel? What's the spare parts availability like? Because frankly, I'm not sure there's that much of a robust supply chain out there for T-34 spare parts in 2024. One of the very few clues we might have about readiness rates and quality control in the North Korean Defence Industrial Base comes from the 2010 shelling of Yongpyong Island. There, ROK estimates are that the North fired about 170 122mm artillery rockets at the island, of which half failed to actually hit the island, and 25% of those that did reportedly failed to detonate. That example obviously relates specifically to one type of artillery munition, but many of the same concerns, manufacturing quality control, age of manufacture, storage conditions, etc., also apply to larger platforms and systems. And those questions around things like readiness and quality control probably just compound the third point, which is the overall mechanisation level of the force. The KPA ground forces on paper do have a very large amount of heavy equipment, but it's still far short of what you would actually need to mechanise the entire force. And in that 600,000 strong reserve component we discussed earlier, you'll find 40 infantry divisions, 18 infantry brigades, and not a single armoured or mechanised formation. In part, you could argue that might reflect the very difficult terrain on the Korean Peninsula in which the KPA expects to fight. But given the shortages also reportedly extend to things like supply trucks, the mobility and equipment levels of some of these units probably leaves a fair bit to be desired, leaving you with the picture of a very large overall ground force with a distinct 1950s flavour to it. Before we move on to the air component though, in classic Perun fashion, I probably need to add a caveat to the caveats. All of the elements we've just talked about, like readiness issues, the age of equipment, or overall mechanisation levels, all probably point in the direction of the KPA being less effective in a large-scale conventional force-on-force fight than its raw numbers might suggest. This isn't a machine gun versus spear situation by any stretch, but the ROK probably does have a major advantage in modern metal. And the potential logistical frailty of the KPA ground forces probably do place some pretty firm boundaries on what it might expect to accomplish against a better equipped and better supplied opposing army. But just because the force might not be able to defeat opposing armies, that doesn't mean it isn't extremely dangerous. North Korea's thousands of artillery systems, MRLs, and ballistic missiles may not have the accuracy necessary to precisely engage South Korean artillery systems like the K9 Thunder. They could probably manage to reach and hit a range of civilian targets, say for example the sprawling South Korean capital of Seoul, meaning that millions and millions of civilians in the south have to live not just under the spectre of attack by North Korean weapons of mass destruction, but also the prospect of a large-scale conventional bombardment. And the fighting in Ukraine has already given us plenty of examples of what the results of that sort of bombardment might look like. That brings us to the discussion of the Korean People's Army Air Force, and here, compared to the ground forces, there's going to be a lot fewer in the way of caveats. As a general rule, the tax you pay for being behind the technological curve in the air is significantly steeper than on the ground. Turning up to a modern fight with a World War I rifle, for example, is very different to turning up with a World War I fighter. And when you compare the North Korean aircraft inventory to its likely opponents, the ROK Air Force and the United States Air Force, you're talking more a technological chasm than a gap. In terms of raw personnel and airframe count, the KPAF is actually one of the larger air forces in the world. We're talking roughly 110,000 active duty personnel and 545 combat aircraft. But the airframe inventory was probably looking fairly tired 40 years ago. The fighter force, which on paper has a bit over 400 airframes, is believed to operate a range of battle-proven models. This may still include a number of MiG-15s, a type which flew in the Korean War, more than 100 MiG-17s, 100 MiG-19s, and 150 MiG-21s, all designs which saw service in the Vietnam War, and at the absolute top of the pile, one regiment flying perhaps 18 MiG-29s. To put that into perspective, on paper, Saddam Hussein probably had, on average, a more modern fighter force in 1991. And we all know how that one ended. Trying to imagine engagements between platforms like the MiG-17, 19 and 21, presumably with no AWACS support, up against a force that would likely be fielding the likes of, I don't know, F-22, F-35, F-15 Slam Eagle, or eventually KF-21, sounds to me less like an air combat scenario as a drawn-out aerial execution. And that presumes a lot of these aircraft would be able to make it in the air and find their opponents in the first place. Storing and maintaining an artillery cannon or basic armoured vehicle for 50, 60, 70 years is one thing. keeping an airframe safe and reliable after that time is an entirely different feat. Just ask the Americans or the Russians what sort of resources have been necessary to keep things like the B-52 or Tu-95 flying. As for whether or not the DPRK has been sparing the necessary resources for preventative maintenance, spare parts, and of course flying hours to keep its pilots up to speed on these ancient platforms, that's obviously an unknowable mystery that I'll leave to the audience. Though I'll note that a DIA piece reports that North Korean pilots are reportedly restricted to as few as 15 to 25 flying hours per year. The DPRK's bomber force is made up entirely of approximately 80 Ilyushin 28s, NATO reporting name Beagle. The Ilyushin 28 was arguably a fairly good aircraft when it was first introduced in 1950, but over time it grew so obsolete that even the Soviet Union was able to basically phase these things out before it collapsed, and in 2024 there is only one country on Earth believed to still operate this as a military aircraft. I could keep putting the boot in, but at this point you probably get the picture. The IL-28 probably would have struggled to survive against North Korea's likely opponents in the 1960s or 70s. In the 2020s, it would probably have about as much chance as a go-kart on the F1 grid. And from a defence economics perspective, I have serious questions as to why you would even bother to try and maintain units of the thing. In the absence of a modern fighter force, you might then expect the DPRK to at least have an advanced air defence system. After all, in Ukraine, after nearly 2.5 years of fighting, we still see a degree of mutual air denial, where neither side can routinely fly manned aircraft deep into opposing territory for fear of ground-based air defences. The thing is, though, Russia started that invasion with the largest stockpile of ground-based air defence systems of any country in Europe. Ukraine started with the second biggest stockpile. And so when we as outside observers are watching that war and trying to take potential lessons from it, I think we have to remember that that conflict is being shaped by two of the largest air defence stockpiles in the world going head-to-head. In terms of air defence assets, North Korea falls far, far short of even Ukrainian levels. According to Military Balance, there are perhaps 10 launches for the S-200 and about 180 for the S-75, aka SA-5 and SA-2 respectively. SA-2 entered service in 1957 and posed a significant threat to the US Air Force during the Vietnam War. But in 2024, especially a lot of the variants North Korea have are likely to be hopelessly, hilariously obsolete. North Korea also has a variety of short-range air defence systems, in particular thousands upon thousands of old-school anti-aircraft guns. But while Ukrainian experience has shown those might be useful against things like one-way attack drones, I wouldn't exactly rate their chances against targets like fast jets or cruise missiles. So while predicting the future with absolute certainty is obviously a fool's errand, in the event of a large-scale conventional conflict on the Korean Peninsula, it may be the only way for North Korean aircraft to avoid being rapidly shot down is if they never take off in the first place and are destroyed on the ground instead. The quantitative and qualitative gap in just about everything is arguably so great that you're probably more likely to see an outcome resembling 1991 than 2022. And while you might be able to theorise some scenarios where the balance with the opposing air forces is tipped, say for example by nuclear attacks against US and South Korean air bases, at that point your plan involves the first use of weapons of mass destruction against a nuclear superpower, something which sounds like a very rapid way to significantly shorten your government's expected lifespan. In short, while the KPA Air Force probably does consume significant North Korean resources, the capabilities it provides are probably far, far less relevant in any wartime scenario than those of the ground forces. The DPRK's navy, such as it is considerably smaller than both the air and ground forces. Geographic realities mean that for its size, the DPRK actually has some fairly long coastlines. And given that North Korea's potential opponents include such minor naval powers as South Korea, Japan, and the United States, a lot of the focus of the roughly 60,000-strong navy is on defending that coastline and its adjacent waters. In looking at the force composition of the North Korean Navy, you might be reminded of some of the other forces we've previously looked at, in particular Iran. Like Iran, North Korea has invested fairly heavily in large numbers of small, affordable surface and subsurface platforms. The Navy only has 2 principal surface combatants, both old frigates, and so far as the condition of those vessels go, I've included an image of one of those from 1993 on the right there, complete with what appears to be a vegetable garden on the deck. It's those smaller elements then that are much more numerous. There are more than 60 submarines of various types, and a casual 370-plus patrol and coastal combatants, according to Military Balance. That large figure, though, does deserve a bit of an asterisk, because of those 370-plus vessels, only a small minority have any sort of anti-ship missile armament. The vast majority would instead have to rely on things like their guns to pose any credible threat to naval or air targets. One strange investment decision among the many strange investment decisions that comes through when you're looking through the North Korean equipment list is that the country still on paper maintains a significant amphibious warfare capability. We're talking maybe 10 landing ships and an estimated 255 landing craft of various types, because carrying out opposed amphibious landings is famously practical for nations lacking offensive air and naval power. In equipment terms, the land-based coastal defence forces are a bit of a mixed bag. There are reportedly a pair of coastal defence regiments equipped with anti-ship missiles, but there's also a not insignificant amount of 130, 152 and 122mm tube artillery, perhaps useful under very niche circumstances like an enemy amphibious landing, but not exactly the latest and greatest in coastal defence kit. But here's the thing, for all the stuff in the North Korean inventory that you could rightfully class as ancient or obsolete, I think it's important to stress that it is probably always dangerous to underestimate a submarine in its home waters, even if it is loud, slow, and short-ranged. Many of North Korea's larger submarines derive from the old Soviet Romeos, which first entered service in the late 1950s. Others, like the Yono class, fit squarely in the midget category. Those submarines are believed to displace something like 120 tons submerged, have a crew of 2, a submerged range of less than 60 miles, and an underwater top speed of about 8 knots. But it's still believed one of these tiny craft may have been responsible for sinking a South Korean corvette back in 2010. Perhaps the most interesting submarine in the North Korean inventory is the one you can now see on screen. We first got images of this boat, hull number 841, being launched back in 2023, and North Korean media reportedly announced it as a tactical nuclear attack submarine, which is a tad confusing from a naming convention perspective because, as best as we can tell, the submarine appears to be a conventionally, not nuclear-powered, ballistic missile, not attack submarine, and the tactical designation might be an interesting choice given the presumed nuclear armament. Basically, what they appear to have done is taken an old Romeo-class hull and added a missile compartment, which, based on the diameter of the missile tubes, may be intended to accommodate 4 SLBMs and 6 smaller missiles. When it was first launched, South Korean sources said the submarine didn't appear to be ready for normal operations, and there were signs that North Korea may have, quote, exaggerated its capabilities, end quote. But it still appears to represent, at the very least, a statement of intent to introduce some missile-carrying capability into the North Korean submarine force. And over the longer term, if successful, that could potentially be quite significant, because those submarine assets could be combined with another element of North Korea's military inventory, Pyongyang's small but significant arsenal of atomic weapons. In a sense, North Korea's nuclear program actually dates back to the 1950s, and the country brought its first research reactor online in 1967. But serious progress towards a nuclear weapon is only believed to have started after the country withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty back in 2002. Between 2006 and 2017, it's believed that North Korea carried out around 6 nuclear tests. Successive tests demonstrated generally higher explosive yields, according to seismic data. And the September 2017 test generated a much larger seismic signature than those that had come before. In 2024, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist published a report suggesting that North Korea had likely created enough fissile material for around 90 nuclear warheads and assembled probably around 50. Account for the fact that a number of warheads are believed to have been detonated during the testing process, and this is probably the world's smallest known nuclear inventory. Although given the famous information opacity of the North Korean government, getting an accurate inventory picture is obviously going to be very difficult. What we do know is that the North Koreans have publicly made some pretty ambitious statements for their nuclear weapons program. In 2021, Kim Jong-un announced several key strategic goals for the nuclear weapons program, put forward as a 5-year plan. These included producing, quote, supersized nuclear warheads, end quote, producing smaller and lighter nuclear weapons for tactical uses, improving precision strike and range capabilities, introducing hypersonic gliding flight warheads, and developing solid fuel engine-propelled intercontinental underwater and ground ballistic rockets. If that wasn't enough, Goal 6 was introducing a nuclear-powered submarine and underwater-launched nuclear strategic weapons, which is obviously no small ask for a country with an economy smaller than some international corporations. And yet, to quote from that aforementioned report, North Korea appears to have made significant progress on these goals and has since introduced more demands, including the dramatic increase of missile production and cutting-edge strategic weapon engines, end quote. While we could debate the significance of the progress one way or the other, the reality is there has been progress. North Korea has produced nuclear warheads, and work appears to be ongoing. And in answer to the basic question you're probably asking of just how, persistence, foreign technology, and prioritization are probably all factors that play their roles. From a priority perspective, North Korea has even gone so far as to entrench their nuclear forces in the state's constitution. Different countries put different laws, rights, and protections in their constitutions. But putting anything along the lines of "thou shalt have nukes" in there is a pretty distinctly North Korean move. Describing the move back in 2023, Kim Jong-un reportedly said that, quote, "The DPRK's nuclear force building policy has been made permanent as the basic law of the state, which no one is allowed to flout with anything." He would also describe North Korea's nuclear status as irreversible, and reports would note that the new law did allow for the preemptive use of nuclear weapons. In order to actually use a nuclear weapon, however, on a target that isn't your backyard, you need a delivery system. And for many nations, including North Korea, developing and fielding those systems is often as much or more of a challenge than the warheads themselves. At present, the DPRK isn't believed to be a nuclear triad state. Air delivery using the Ilyushin-28s might be theoretically possible, although doubtful against modern air defence systems. And while the Navy appears to be striving for a practical submarine-based solution, for now that appears to very much be a work in progress. And so, at least in the here and now, Pyongyang probably relies on its extensive missile inventory as a potential nuclear delivery option. That inventory is believed to include an eclectic mix of systems from older Scuds all the way through to liquid-fueled road-mobile ICBMs like the Hwasong 14 and 15. And you can see a table of some of the known types and their suspected ranges on the right there. It's worth noting that the Hwasong 17, tested in 2022, is believed to potentially be designed for accommodating multiple nuclear warheads at once, a MIRV-capable weapon. That could potentially make it more suitable for penetrating missile defences than older North Korean systems, which were designed with unitary warheads. In hard strategic terms, the current North Korean nuclear inventory is believed to be in something of a strange place. It's certainly large enough to be scary. Even a single nuclear warhead poses a significant threat to any population centre it might be fired at, but it's still missing a lot of the features that the other nuclear powers we've previously looked at tend to strive for in their nuclear arsenals, the things that make them most effective as potential deterrents. And here, I think there are two potential shortcomings that probably worry Pyongyang the most. The first being survivability, and the second, reliability against defended targets. In terms of survivability, most nuclear states will aim to have a reliable second strike capability. But for the DPRK, especially against potential opponents like the United States that are known for having a full range of precision strike options available to them, the survival puzzle isn't necessarily a simple one. A single dodgy diesel-electric boomer isn't exactly enough to maintain a continuous at-sea survivable deterrent. And while North Korea's mobile ground-based launchers are probably more difficult to track than things like nuclear missile silos, they're also potentially much more vulnerable if they can be located. In part to protect valuable military assets like launch systems, the USDIA assesses that North Korea's underground facilities program is the largest and most fortified in the world. In 1963, Kim Il-sung publicly announced that the entire nation must be made into a fortress. We must dig into the ground to protect ourselves. And in 2024, North Korea is believed to have thousands of tunnels and bunkers, ranging from small shelters for a couple of individuals, all the way up to a smaller number of larger, more complex facilities for command and control, missiles, or other strategic assets. These might provide some degree of protection for North Korean strategic forces in the event of a crisis, but there are still obviously going to be risks involved, with a relatively small overall inventory and the chance that an opponent, for example, locates the shelters where missiles are being stored and decides, one way or the other, to make sure that they never come out again. Problem 2 is even if a couple of North Korean missiles survive and are able to launch, there's a question of whether they could actually penetrate opposing missile defences. I've talked in the past about how nations like Russia have sometimes described the deployment of missile defence systems as some sort of strategic escalation, a major threat to the strategic balance. That's always struck me as a bit strange because given the size and diversity of, for example, the Russian or Chinese missile fleets, any missile defence system, at least now or in the medium term, is likely to be completely overwhelmed by a full-scale attack, resulting in nuclear warheads finding their way to their targets and inflicting unacceptable damage. But the DPRK isn't the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China. The number of very long-range missiles and miniaturized warheads is much smaller, the number of potential launch locations limited to the Korean Peninsula rather than anywhere in the world using a nuclear submarine, and the reliability levels of observed North Korean equipment are generally at a level where the missile defense system may not have to do anything at all in some cases, allowing North Korean quality control to do a job that would normally be done by interceptor missiles. South Korean, Japanese, or US missile defense systems may not have that much of a chance in a full exchange with a major opposing power, but an exchange with North Korea could potentially be a very different story. The two obvious caveats here are that, one, when you're talking about things like a potential nuclear exchange, obviously there are always going to be some risks involved. And given that those risks might include the nuclear devastation of some of your larger cities if your missile defense system doesn't function as intended, you can imagine it would likely take something pretty extraordinary to convince political leaders to take that risk in the first place. The second point is that over time, there's nothing to say the balance can't shift from the shield to the sword, as North Korea continues to enhance its inventory. The force now has more warheads and more and better missiles than it did a decade ago. And the moves towards testing things like multiple independent re-entry vehicles or submarine-launched missiles are all indicators that North Korea is investing pretty heavily in the idea of trying to breach missile defense systems. But developing those solutions and then deploying them at scale is likely to require even more resources from a country famously short on them. And so one great concern to countries like the US or the Republic of Korea is that the DPRK might get some sort of external assistance, whether that be technology, advice, or simply additional economic resources to enable it to push these programs forward. Which brings us to the final point in this episode, the recent cooperation between Pyongyang and Moscow. I covered most of the substance of the North Korean-Russian Partnership Agreement in a previous episode, so I won't recount all those details here. But I do think it stands as an important final point in this episode, as another example of why the world, despite North Korea's dismal economy, can't afford to ignore it. Politically, to many of us, the DPRK is going to appear to be a pretty strange place. Its tightly controlled physical and digital borders mean that its global cultural influence is relatively limited, and unlike, for example, Russia, it doesn't really have any significance to the global economy, and so the temptation might be there for decision makers to try and ignore it. But both the country's nuclear weapons and its developing relationship with Russia is likely to make that increasingly difficult for some nations to do going forward. In terms of what Pyongyang can potentially do for Moscow, the list is pretty short but also very significant. Russia is fighting an attritional war in Ukraine. Its own equipment reserves are increasingly being run down, and if it's going to maintain its current burn rates going forward, there's going to be a premium on them finding new sources of replacement equipment and munitions. So far, the DPRK has already been a vital contributor of artillery munitions to the Russian cause. But, provided the Russian military isn't too picky when it comes to quantity, and the DPRK can be convinced to let some of its equipment go, on paper, North Korea has an enormous stock of Soviet-era or Soviet-derived equipment that could potentially be used by the Russian military. It's pretty light up on certain categories like infantry fighting vehicles, but there are a lot of things like tanks and artillery systems, and just about all the old-school multiple rocket launchers you could possibly want. It probably wouldn't be great for Russia's military prestige if its troops eventually had to start going to battle in North Korean versions of Soviet equipment, but given the choice between running down Russia's military prestige and its equipment stores, there's probably going to be a lot of incentive for Ukraine's allies to try and make sure those sort of supplies are never sent. On the flip side, there's also potentially a lot that Russia might be able to do for North Korea. As far as many nations like Japan and the Republic of Korea are concerned, North Korea is already a significant security threat. But that threat is at least partially limited by all of the things that North Korea is very short on. Think things like food, fuel, and the human capital to embrace a wide range of modern technologies and innovations. Russia potentially could assist on all those fronts and more. Russia has oil and petroleum products to spare. It's a food exporter. Its financial reserves are diminishing, but by no means gone, and there are a wide array of military technologies in useful fields, from rocketry to submarine design, that Russia could potentially assist with or transfer, if the decision was ever made to do so and the price was right. So far, we haven't seen any announcements to that effect, nor any evidence of that sort of exchange occurring. Ammo for food and oil, yes. Everything else, not yet. But my key point here is the need to be forward-looking and open to the ways this might develop. Maybe nothing much comes of this, and military developments in North Korea continue much as they have to date. But we probably need to be prepared for the potential implications, both in Ukraine and Asia, if Moscow and Pyongyang ever decide to take their relationship to the next level. Ultimately, as always, only time will tell. Okay, very brief channel update to close out because this video is on the longer side. Thank you for the patrons who voted for or commented in favour of this video. I have been looking forward to making it for months at this point, and I'm happy to finally have a chance to do so. The biggest difficulty, I think, with North Korea is to try and strike a balance between acknowledging a lot of the distinctive ridiculousness of the overall situation, while also understanding how deadly serious and costly it is. My hope is that I've been able to reflect a valid balance between the two, and that you all enjoyed the episode. Thank you very much for your support as always, and I hope to see you all again next week.